cooking at home and selling things to people on the internet is sort of how I started out in tech, which never felt like a job. I started a company with a friend in college, and we would just work out of his living room. And it wasn't until I'd been a programmer for 4 years that I was okay calling myself that.
You're listening to Easy Cook Bear, a food and culture show about how we cook, connect, and create. My name is Lee-Sean. Together with my guests, we'll be sharing stories, swapping recipes, and exploring the creative processes of people who make art, culture, food, music, and more. Easy Cook Bear. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Easy Cook Bear. I'm Lee-Sean. Our guest today is a former programmer and product manager turned culinary student, plant-based cook. Kate Ray, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lee-Sean, for having me.
So I've been following you on Twitter for a while and been a fan, but this is the first time we've actually talked. So I look forward to learning more about you and your incredible journey. You were previously a programmer at places like ACLU, Recurse Center, Let's Experiment, Automatic, and Scroll Kit, and now you're in culinary school. But can we go back to that? How did you get into tech in the first place? And then we'll talk about your current transition.
Sure. So I actually studied journalism and psychology at NYU, and then got into tech at the end of school. Then it was 2010, which was a pretty exciting time for tech in New York. It was a lot smaller.
Yeah.
There were companies, I think it was Kickstarter, Tumblr, Foursquare, formerly Dodgeball, were the main New York companies that we had. And it just felt like the most exciting place to be. People were trying out all these different ways of creating interactions online and experimenting, and we didn't really know where it was going to go. So I was attracted to that. And then that sort of gets into my transition out of it, which is that over the last 10 years, a lot of that changed. There's a lot more money in the industry. We kind of saw the answer, where interesting interactions go. Foursquare back then was pretty cool. I actually made a lot of projects based on its API because you were seeing how people interacted when they were close or not as close. And they're rebranding because they're now a fully B2B data company. They've abandoned their user product, which makes sense from a business perspective because all of those really interesting companies couldn't keep it up.
Right. And we're also not going out in the same way we were before.
That's true. So really this last year of quarantine, I think, has showed us even more explicitly the limits of what seemed like really new, deep online interactions, which is that when they're all we have, they're so much paler and flatter than real life interactions. So I think that has a lot to do with what got me into food, which is the most physical kind of thing you can make. Or there's a lot of them out there, but the one that I liked anyway. And wanting to create experiences through food that actually engage all your senses and that you can connect with in a completely different way.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more about that in a sec. But first things first, did you have breakfast this morning and what did you have?
I did. I always have breakfast. And in the winter, I pretty much always have oatmeal. I get kind of bored of it sometimes. So today I put turmeric in it.
Ooh.
For some extra flavor. But yeah, that just makes me feel full and warm for the rest of the day. I'm usually a very cold person.
Yeah, I run cold as well. Do you make the oatmeal from scratch, or is it the instant stuff, or do you have a trick for that?
I use the old-fashioned oats, not the steel cut kind. But I did go to culinary school and actually learned a trick for making better oatmeal. which is to put the water and the oats in at the same time. Rather, I used to like boil the water and then add in some oats.
Yeah.
Basically, the oats would never absorb the water as much, but when they heat up at the same time, the oats kind of like break open and absorb all the water, and it becomes more of like a thick porridge. And it feels very fancy and nice, but it only takes, 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that trick. I'm pretty lazy when it comes to this, and I don't have oatmeal that often, but when I do, I just make it in the rice cooker. I'll like put it in the rice cooker overnight and set the timer on things. And I actually prefer it as a savory thing. So I'll basically like eat oatmeal like it's a congee with savory things rather than like brown sugar or, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I had a savory oatmeal phase. I would put like eggs and furikake, sesame oil. A lot of the time it's really good on it.
Nice. Easy Cook Bear. Let's go back to talking about this transition into food. Was this a decision you made pre-COVID, or was it a thing that was triggered by COVID?
It was pre-COVID. So I actually had quit my job on March 4th was my last day. I was supposed to start culinary school on March 18th. So on March 16th is when they were like, not going to happen.
Wow.
So that was it was a sudden time where I was at home with nothing to do, no job, which I think was a lot better for me. I didn't spend 10 hours a day on Zoom like most people I knew, but I had lots of time to just think and then cook. And I tried a bunch of cooking projects and stuff over quarantine. But it was a strange moment.
And how does culinary school work in a socially distanced environment? Like, did it get shut down? Did you move online, or do you just have to mask it up and take those precautions?
So it was shut down until September, and we started up again then, and still going right now. They did a bunch of things, like there's sort of all these plastic barriers between people's stations, and you wear masks all the time. When you're tasting food, you're supposed to like pull the mask down, put a spoon in your mouth, and like put it back up. But a lot of the, all of the rules of being in a sanitary kitchen do make it safer. So like you're constantly washing your hands. The ventilation is really good in the kitchens. So it feels pretty good. And I take the ferry to get into Manhattan every day. And that's like a lot less crowded than the subway.
Yeah, I love the idea of commuting by boat, by ferry. I briefly worked on Staten Island, which was kind of a pain of a commute. I was living in Lower Manhattan at the time, but just the going across water and seeing the Statue of Liberty on my commute was pretty romantic and classic New York.
Mm-hmm. I like to see all the container ships, and things are still coming from other places in the world, even though we're not traveling around.
Yeah. And so speaking of traveling around, since we're not doing a lot of that right now, do you find yourself cooking things from places that you've been or places that you'd like to go as a kind of like proxy for travel? Or do you more have like your style or your kind of cooking that you follow?
A bit of both. I would say I normally just kind of like rotate all around the world in what I'm cooking, probably too much. I've actually been noticing how I build up ingredients, and like it would be better for me to stick to at least a few regions.
Yeah.
Like last year when it was really cold, I just started craving like Southeast Asian and like tropical kind of foods, which is also not in season. So can't do too much of that, but I would just try to make like, I don't know, some like coconut sticky rice, a lot of coconut based things, or get a mango every now and then.
Yeah. That's great. I love these tropical flavors too. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of this history. I like to ask my guests what their culinary heritage is, and that's pretty open-ended, but it's basically like what kind of foods did you grow up with your family? What were the things that you were making for yourself or considered to be like comfort food or childhood foods?
That's actually interesting because I've been thinking about it a lot recently. So I have sort of a complicated relationship, I would say, to my culinary heritage. I'm half Chinese, and my grandmother came here from China before the Cultural Revolution, like just early 1900s. But she was from a rich family in China, so she never cooked when she was there. Once she came to the US, she started teaching herself how to cook from Chinese cookbooks and ended up teaching like housewives in Los Angeles about cooking Chinese food. But it was sort of this Americanized version of Chinese food, a little bit like what she thought they thought Chinese food was. And then when my mother was born, she had that first or second generation immigrant experience of not wanting to have anything to do with like these weird foods with different smells. She wanted to be as American as possible. So she would demand macaroni and cheese or hamburgers for every meal. So my grandmother was cooking like 2 meals for every meal for my grandfather and my mom. So that was kind of what I grew up with as comfort food. Mm-hmm. She would make pot roasts and meatloaf and challah bread a lot. She learned that from a neighbor. And then I think now I cook a lot more Chinese food than she ever does, but I really cook from different regions. Like I like Sichuan food. I just got the Xi'an Famous Foods cookbook, so I'm going to try some Xi'an foods. But I don't have really a connection to those regions. That's not even where my family is from.
Right. What region is your family from in China?
So we think Beijing or Shanghai, but we're not really sure about a lot of things. Mm-hmm. My grandmother was always sort of vague and then started, saying incomprehensible things towards the end of her life. So I was actually trying to figure it out a little bit based on what she was cooking, because Shanghainese food tends to be sweeter and like she would cook pretty sweet things. Yeah. But we don't really know that much, and there aren't really that many records. So it's like it's kind of an interesting 3 generations of women not cooking exactly what their parents did. And I've been thinking about like trying to create a dinner sometime that explores that, this sort of like feeling of being an imposter in your own culture or in another one through what you're cooking.
Yeah. It's interesting too. I'm also half Chinese on my dad's side, and my grandparents are they were Cantonese speaking, but they moved over to Taiwan in the 40s, but they weren't like Hong Kongers or from that sort of Guangzhou region. They were from closer to the Vietnamese border. And so just remember my grandmother's cooking. She had a few things that she said were like from the hometown that were like, unique to that. But then after being in Taiwan for so long, like she would also do like Northern Chinese things that she learned from neighbors and like Taiwanese local things. And so it was this kind of mix of things. And they didn't go back to their hometown until like decades later just to visit. Have you been to China to try to explore some of these roots?
Yeah, I chose to study abroad there. So I was there for about 6 months during college. And then started to develop my own relationship to it. I was in Shanghai, so I would eat all the street food that they had out there. And like, I think that's where I first had tomato and egg, which is like a pretty classic Chinese comfort food that now I make a lot here, but it's not something that I grew up with.
And so you're also a plant-based chef. Did you grow up vegetarian, or was there a moment where you made that transition?
I didn't. And meat was pretty central to the American comfort food that my mom would make.
Oh, right. You said the pot roast and all that.
Yeah.
Burgers.
So we would eat meat like at pretty much every meal. And I think they still do. And try to like, whenever I'm over with my parents, I'll like try to get them to eat more vegetarian food. But I was a teenager, so it's been like 17 years or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had a lot of reasons at the time. Starting to learn about like the farm industry and just loved animals in general. And I think for me, it's just a pretty easy choice. I think there's a lot of ways to kind of be like a responsible meat eater,
mm-hmm.
which has a lot to do with like paying for some of the good stuff. But I don't really miss it. I have gotten good enough at cooking that I can satisfy whatever umami cravings I have or enough protein or something. So it's just like, of all the various ways that we can try to like help get the planet on better track, this one to me fits really well with my life.
Yeah. Was there like a moment for you where it's like, okay, you're going to be vegetarian, or was it more of like a gradual transition when you made that transition?
I think it was more gradual. I think there was a moment when I realized I hadn't eaten meat in a week or something. And then just like, okay, let's try this. And then I've tried to go back to eating meat sometimes when traveling, because it can make it pretty hard. But as soon as I learn how to ask for dishes that don't have it, I transition back. So like, I think when I went to China, I would initially be eating some meat, and then I learned how to say like, no meat, or I don't eat meat. And I learned the food that I liked that didn't have it. So I was able to just like navigate around that.
So even though you've left tech,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you're still very techy in some ways. Like I see you're active on Twitter a lot. You have a tiny letter. You've created this newsletter where you've been posting a holiday gift guide and just sharing your experiences in culinary school. So can you talk about how your experience in tech is still carrying over to what you're doing now?
Yeah, in different ways. Been thinking a lot about the practice of like working as a programmer and working as a cook. I haven't started working as a chef yet, really.
Mm-hmm.
Although I guess the ways in which I have started working in that, which is just like cooking at home and selling things to people on the internet, is sort of how I started out in tech, which never felt like a job. I like started a company with a friend in college, and we would just work out of his living room. And it wasn't until I'd been a programmer for like 4 years that I was okay calling myself that. But I think both of them are these passions that start out where you're alone in your kitchen or on your computer, and you're sort of like working through problems and being creative. And that's the thing that you love. But then in tech, it like very quickly goes out away from just being yourself on your own on your computer, and you're working with a team.
Yeah.
And that's what most of your job is. Maybe like 20% is this like time spent in your head where you get to be really creative. And a lot of it is learning how to collaborate with people, which became what I liked, like especially at jobs that were boring. It was the people who I was working with who were like the reason I would go there every day. So as I get more into like cooking professionally, I think the same thing will happen. It's already happening with my classmates in the kitchen, where I start to get the sense of like what a really well-functioning team in a kitchen looks like, which is basically the same as like a well-functioning product team.
Yeah. You're giving me so much to want to ask about, both on the team side of things, the entrepreneurship side of things. But let's just jump back in time for a little bit and we'll come back. You mentioned starting up a company coming out of college. Can we talk more about that company? Also, what were you guys eating? Like, was it the classic startup thing of like takeout pizza and Chinese food, or were you like cooking for yourselves then?
Yeah, it was a bit classic. There was a Family Dollar near our apartment, and we would buy a lot of ramen and cook that. I started to get creative with like, the instant ramen. Like I would put vegetables into it, or I would make like macaroni and cheese with Family Dollar cheese out of it. And that is actually where I started cooking a lot regularly, because we didn't have like a lot of extra money. We were trying to meet all these people who worked in tech in New York. So I started to have Sunday dinners almost every week for a while, where we would kind of like invite people who we thought were cool but didn't know that well. They would come all the way out to Bushwick, which in 2010 was more of a trek for people. So they would stay.
Yeah, that was like a safari back then.
Yeah. But it was cool. And then if you had a party, people would stay for like 7 hours or something, because they didn't have friends nearby. So I would cook a lot of food that was kind of like cheap to scale up. And then that was the main way that we kind of connected to people. But yeah, back to what we were doing. There were a bunch of different projects. A lot of them came out of working in journalism, but being interested in how the internet was changing that. So there was like an earlier iteration, started out as this platform in which you could try to pose a question to a public figure and then get a crowd around you to kind of put public pressure on them to answer that question, which was kind of cool. Some of these things, I wonder if they would work better today. They'd probably be worse today because there are a lot more bots on the internet.
Yeah.
But that ended up going through a few iterations and became this thing, Scroll Kit, which was a way to make a web page that was very intuitive. It was kind of like a children's drawing tool. Like me and my co-founder both used Kid Pics a lot when we were little. And so it had like kind of like stickers, and you could just stick something anywhere on the web page, use like CSS absolute positioning to just kind of let you put things somewhere and leave them there.
Yeah.
And had some cool scrolling effects because everybody was into like parallax scrolling things at that time. And that actually never really made sense as a business. People would like make Valentine's Day cards or make posters for an event or something on it. But I really wish something like that still existed, because now there aren't really ways to kind of like make something that's yours online unless you code.
Right.
You just have like Squarespace or Facebook or some Instagram that give you really narrow windows in which you can like change a picture or write some text or something.
Yeah, there's a real glory days of MySpace and like the backgrounds and the audio and all of these sort of things, or GeoCities before that.
Yeah. I think we got compared a lot to GeoCities and MySpace, which made me feel really good.
That's awesome. Easy Cook Bear. So a few things I'd love to explore. One is the entrepreneurship angle, but also the community building. So you were talking about these dinner parties you used to host. And since we can't really do that right now, how have you been redirecting that energy? I find like I'm missing hosting dinner parties a lot. And this podcast is one of the ways I'm trying to redirect that energy. So I'm curious how you've been thinking about that.
Yeah, I've definitely been missing them a lot. I wrote one newsletter back in like April as kind of like a second person fictional dinner party, because I was like, just like wanted to like draw in all the details from my memories of those. But I have come up with some ways. So one thing, like I would say my favorite food event that I've been doing for like 6 years now is a dumpling party. Right around this time in the holidays every December, where everybody would bring dumplings, a lot of times homemade dumplings, and then we cook them all together and like eat Eastern European, Chinese, Japanese, Indian samosas, way too many for a long time. And it's like a really nice creative process for everybody to make these, and then just like fun to have this whole mess of dumplings. So I've been very sad about not being able to do that this year, but have got a few of the regulars of that party to make some dumplings this week. And then we're just going to meet up in a park and exchange like frozen dumplings this weekend, and then have a Zoom party where we like eat them.
Oh, that's so nice.
Talk about it.
Yeah, I love your ecumenical definition of dumplings too, to be inclusive of like samosas or anything kind of wrapped. I guess like an empanada is a dumpling of sorts too.
I've thought about this over the years, and the definition I came up with is like a small, an unleavened dough with a filling that can be eaten in 3 bites or less.
Okay.
To try to rule out like empanadas and, filled buns or something.
Got it. Okay.
At one point I had a filled bread party in the summer to make up for all the things that don't fit into dumplings, because there's lots of good food in that category too.
Got it. So there's something kind of more dainty and bite-sized about dumplings in your definition.
I think the bite-sized part is key, because that's what lets you eat lots of different types of them.
Yeah. And so you've been doing these community things with your friends, and you've also mentioned you've been cooking and selling things on the internet. So it seems like you're continuing to be entrepreneurial there. Can you tell us more about that? Sure.
Over the summer, I started trying to make like Chinese pork buns, because that's like a comfort food that I grew up with. Even though my mom didn't really make that much Chinese food, we would go to Chinese bakeries all the time.
Yeah.
And I missed pork buns because I haven't found really good vegetarian versions of them, of like the baked kind specifically. So I was working on a recipe for that. And then I think I started just bringing some to friends, and then decided to just like make a Shopify and see if people wanted to buy them. So at one point I was making like 80 or so a week. And I had a Chinese barbecue flavor, a dan dan noodle flavor, like a Japanese curry flavor, and then a peanut butter and jelly.
Oh, wow.
Kind of dessert one. And I happened to get a car just before quarantine, also unrelated. So I was able to just deliver it to people. And that was really fun. And I sort of like ended up being connected to these people who maybe I didn't know that well. They followed someone I followed or something. But a lot of people really liked the buns.
That's amazing. And so did you treat it more like a pop-up, or is it something that you're still doing?
I haven't been doing it since school started. And it doesn't scale too well. I've been thinking about what I would do next time, partly just because these buns taste so much better fresh that you kind of have to fold them all the day that you're delivering them. Yeah. So I would be getting up at like 4:00 in the morning and folding them for 4 hours or something, and then trying to get them to cool before I delivered. So I'll definitely make them again at some point, but I've been trying to think about things that I could do more of the prep for ahead of time.
Yeah. Could you see yourself doing something like this entrepreneurial with your cooking, or are you looking more to get into like private chefing or working in a restaurant, or how do you see that?
I want to learn from other people, especially right now. So I think working in a restaurant, at least for like a short amount of time, is a pretty good way to learn a lot of stuff. Working with other people on events could be good. I do have dreams of someday having a place that's maybe more like a cafe than a restaurant, but where I could just like do events or let other people do events that could just sort of be like a community space in a neighborhood.
Yeah. You already mentioned that you've been taking these precautions in culinary school for COVID and things like that. And I'm sure you've seen how this pandemic has affected your industry. And so how do you think this is going to play out, both short-term and long-term post-COVID? I know this is like a deep and difficult question, but I'd love to hear your take from the inside.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard. There's like so many things going on at once where in some ways all of the stuff of this year has exposed a lot of the problems in the restaurant industry. So there's been kind of like another Me Too movement inside of it, and just kind of like about general abuse and exploitation of restaurant workers perpetuated by a lot of the restaurant owners that's come out. The precarity of most restaurants and their slim margins has become really apparent. And then there hasn't been much bailout, but a lot of it has helped. I guess I don't know too much about how the loans and everything have worked, but a lot of the really big restaurants are coming out of this okay. And a lot of the really small places that are able to pivot and that don't have that many employees or that much rent seem to be figuring some things out. And a lot of like, I would say the middle is things are just closing down for good. So in some ways, maybe all this attention on what's going on inside of restaurants will be good.
Yeah.
I guess the only thing I hope is that once people learn how much it all costs, they're willing to pay a little bit more for like these experiences.
Yeah.
But then you've also got on the other side, like cloud kitchens and Uber Eats coming up that are completely divorcing people from how their food is made. And that's pretty scary. I think cloud kitchens are like the worst possible way of making food.
Yeah, it just seems so alienated and divorced from like the humans involved in it, right? Yeah, I wonder about that too. If folks are cooking more individually at home in their families, do they appreciate it more? So when they're eating out in restaurants again, they feel like, okay, I can pay more for fairer wages and other conditions. Or if they're just ordering Uber Eats and seamless, it's maybe they continue to be alienated from the food system and the people making the food. Yeah, it's a tough one to call. Where do you see yourself in it then, based on this? I know you're still in school, but where do you see yourself with all of these shifts and shakeups going on in the restaurant industry?
I mean, I think that in any case, the people who I would be trying to kind of like reach through my food would be people who care a lot about it and want and care about food sourcing and want to know as much as they can about it. Mm-hmm. So I think that population of people existed before and will continue to exist. There are places that I really love that I think do this job of being like a cafe, but really like a center for food community. There's this cookbook store in Greenpoint called Archistratus that makes extremely good food, but then has always had events like a cookbook club where people would all cook from the same cookbook and then have kind of like a potluck. And they've still been doing things online. I've been like in a weekly Zoom call with other people who really like this place for most of the pandemic. And so I think just like finding ways of connecting to and cooking for people like that, whether it's in things like pop-ups or catering or through a physical space, is what I'd like to do.
Yeah, that's great. I love that cookbook club idea. I think I might have to try that with some friends. That's great. Easy Cook Bear. Let's turn the tables now, and then we'll end with a lightning round of questions for you again, Kate. But I'd like to have guests on the show basically ask me questions. So we're flipping the script, and you can ask me whatever you want.
Okay. So as I've been in this transition stage from tech to food, a lot of people will ask me, what if you combine the two? Like, you could do something with both. And I usually point out that our examples of tech and food combinations are kind of take like the worst and most exploitative aspects from both of them and put them together. So like DoorDash and Uber Eats, or these cloud kitchens are just like the worst things. I don't want to have anything to do with that. But I guess I'm interested in what you see as interesting overlaps, or if you have any ideas for me about interesting overlaps.
Yeah, I totally agree with you what you mean there in terms of tech and food's intersection is often kind of the worst of things, or it's very much about the Uberification of things, like quite literally in terms of exploiting labor at the cheapest price possible and making things more quote unquote convenient for consumers, but at what human cost. There was a speculative project that one of my students did. I teach a continuing ed course online on essentially futures, so future casting and more speculative design. And a student of mine came up with this idea of essentially like a Siri or an Alexa type bot, but for your kitchen and with a little bit more personality that could essentially like coach you through cooking. So you could like ask it things like, oh, how many grams are in this imperial metric thing, but also like coach you through recipes and things like that. So kind of more something that augments the human and like teaches the human rather than like alienates the human in a way. Like obviously you can go to culinary school as a professional and all of that, but this is meant more for like the home cook to have like some sort of knowledge support, but also like technical support there for things like that. So that was one direction. I also think about it in terms of culinary education in general, but for the public, right? Like there's pedagogical function to restaurants and to food businesses in terms of introducing cultures and introducing techniques to people. I basically learned to cook from the Food Network because both of my parents worked, and if they weren't home, it was basically TV dinners or you had to make something for yourself, you know? So like, what is the next level of that with interactivity, whether it's the bot idea or something like that? That's kind of where I see it, where it's about augmenting the human rather than trying to exploit the human.
Yeah. I've also just wanted, honestly, something that does a lot of what Alexa does, just like helps you convert things or do math or something, but doesn't need to be plugged into the internet.
Yeah, I think that would be a welcome change. So it's not trying to like upsell you things while you're trying to just convert units or something. So you have this tiny letter and you recently wrote a holiday gift guide. Could you recommend some things from the guide for our listeners?
Sure. One thing I put there is this chili crisp sauce called Fly by Jing. Have you encountered it at all?
I haven't tried that brand. I've had the Sea Daddy one, and then there's another one whose name I'm blanking on.
I think, yeah, there are a few out there, and they're sort of like similar to Lao Gan Ma, which is this classic, slightly spicy, mostly very like umami rich sauce that I have loved for a while. I actually made a zine about it with some friends that I'm about to do a reprint of. But Fly by Jing and some of these other ones are a lot like that, but use like fresher ingredients. The woman who started Fly by Jing went over to Chengdu and opened a restaurant there, and now like sources all of her chili peppers and everything from Chengdu. And it's like such a good sauce. You can put it on Chinese food, on eggs, pizza, macaroni and cheese. It's like good on everything.
That's awesome. And do you have an easy cook recipe that you would recommend for our listeners, like something you could just voice over and that anybody could make pretty easily?
Yeah. So I think granola is like really, really easy and really easy to personalize, which I always like in a recipe. Like I feel like the first step in people kind of like building their confidence in the kitchen is realizing that you can swap out ingredients or like change the amounts for whatever you want, but you can't really do that with like sourdough. So I think the granola recipe that I started out with was from salt, acid, fat, heat, Samin Nosrat's recipe. And it's similar to a lot out there. You kind of like start with oats, a bunch of nuts, seeds, whatever kinds you like. And then I usually use olive oil and maple syrup for like the sweetness and the fat, and a lot of salt. So like some salt beforehand, and then right when it comes out of the oven, more salt, and then add in whatever dried fruit I want after it comes out of the oven. Because if you put it in beforehand, it can get kind of hard. So I actually have been making a huge amount of granola yesterday. I've been making this 5-spice one where I made my own 5-spice powder. And then I put stuff like black sesame and golden raisins and candied ginger in it. It's got a lot of things going on, but I'm just sealing it up and sending it out right now to like friends and family who I can't see this year.
Yeah. I love that savory sweet kind of combo, where it's almost like the same logic as like a pumpkin spice or an apple spice, right? Where you're taking that 5-spice and thinking about it as like warm spices that complement these like fruity, gingery kind of flavors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels very like wintry because of all the warming spices.
Wonderful. And then finally, can you tell our listeners where they can find you and follow you online?
Sure. I'm Cray Cray, which is just my name, Kray, Kray, on Twitter and Instagram. So that's mostly where I spend my online time.
Awesome. Well, Kate, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's great to learn more about you and your journey, and good luck with school and all of these endeavors ahead.
Thanks so much. It was really fun to talk to you.
Thanks. Bye.